Back to order. Proceedings are now resumed. For the sake of good order, Mr. Chinsey, first of all, welcome to the Public Accounts Committee. Please state your name and your title.
Vinton Chinsey, Chief Financial Officer for the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chinsey, I'll start things off by just simply asking you, could you describe what you believe is your role as a Chief Financial Officer in regard to ensuring that the principles of good governance described in the Auditor General's report are being adhered to?
Yes, sir. One of the first things, as Mr. Connolly pointed out earlier, Chief Financial Officer's role is not a bean counter.
I don't think you have your microphone on. It certainly is not. There should be a light when you...
Yeah, it's there. Oh, it needs to be, okay. Yeah, it's not merely a bean counter. You play a very strategic role and in guiding the entire organization. Effectively, you become the right hand of any senior manager in the organization. And it's sort of like also a gatekeep position. You have to be the one who oftentimes put certain framework and policies in place to guide the organization and make sure that there is good governance, you have value for money, and proper ethics and code of conduct is adhered to in all of the organization's financial and operational matters. For example, just because there is no procurement law in place, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a policy relating to how procurement is done in your organization, and that's properly communicated to all persons involved. So this doesn't happen overnight. So each organization is different, as we appreciate, but you have to sit down and strategize as to what is needed for the particular organization. Find out what are the greatest need first. There's more need than you can actually satisfy, but there are some that are more critical than others, and you whittle it down from time to time. An example, 8 years ago, we had problems with travel, for instance, in what was then the portfolio of internal and external affairs. We had a large amount of outstanding advances, etc. One of the first things you should do as a CFO is recognize that this is a problem on seeing it and put policies in place to address it, put in a framework, communicate it to everyone, and make sure everybody is trained up. You also have to work on building capacity. We do have a capacity problem. We can only hide ourselves, hide our head in the sand and believe that, yeah, everybody is up to scratch, but that's not necessarily the case. Then you have to sit down and plan what capacity do we need to deliver the results, deliver the financial reports, and train and coach people into what is required. And hopefully you have a very supportive management team which will work with you in doing that. So it's not simply collecting information, putting numbers together, and putting a bunch of spreadsheets and reports forward. Anybody can do that once you have the technical training, but the CFO is a little more than that, sir.
Just following through that, because I think you alluded to some of them, but I mean, can you describe what are the biggest challenges you face as a CFO within the organization in which you work in sort of complying and ensuring that the principles of good governance are being implemented and adhered to?
One of the biggest things is accountability, sir. You have, the organization have to have the culture of making people accountable. And this goes back not just to just drafting performance agreements and performance appraisal, but to actually follow through and instill that. To make somebody accountable, there are several things that's needed. One of which is not only the responsibility to do something, but you also have to give them the resources necessary to do it. So if you're giving somebody accountable for their staffing, and then you're telling them, okay, don't hire the staff you need, hire somebody who doesn't have the skill set, or a group of people, for instance, social employment. I remember it used to be $1,500 to change a lock when public works was doing social employment. We should recognize that it's social employment and deal with it. But you also have to give them the authority over those resources. We do have problems with that at times in terms of chief officers, department heads, and senior managers being able to take decisions and do what is necessary to get the job done.
Mr. Connolly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Chinsey. In terms of I guess going back to the culture of accountability and you know that the organization has to recognize and follow through and carry that out.
Yes, sir.
In your interactions with the political arm and the civil service arm, i.e., the deputy governor being your ultimate line manager, I guess if you're not counting the governor on top of them, how does that role work in allowing you to accomplish what you see as the job that you've just described? And are there times when, and you don't have to say which, or you know, if there are, but are there times when those different entities don't coexist the way that they're supposed to, and how have those how do those things inhibit you from carrying out that function? If you say, I'm leading the question, I'm not trying to get you.
I understand what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay.
That is a problem. One of the major differences is that as a CFO, you have to actually recognize that, and you actually have to have the capability and the skill sets to work with that scenario. Between the deputy governor, the political directorate, cabinet, MLAs, the governor, there are oftentimes conflicts or different views as to where you should go with particular decisions or scenarios. Generally, they will all converge on the global perspective of what is Cayman's best interest. But there are differences. You have to be able to build confidence with whoever you're working with, whether it be the deputy governor, in that you're an advisor and that they should take heed if necessary, as well as the governor, if necessary. The governor used to be part of our portfolio at one point in time, his management of the office. And the politicians, like in our case, our minister is the premier. The best way to deal with that is to actually be open, frank, put all the implications on the table, and make sure that whatever direction is taken, some resolution and some communication as to where we are all going with it. It's not always an easy thing to deal with, because some ministers can be very strong and adamant in what they want. And what I find very often, it's because they may not have all the information. So the first thing you need to do is to get them all the information. And this is why it's also important to have reporting in a very timely and concise manner. You need to make sure that all parties that are party to a decision have the information, and if possible, the same information. We do have a problem with that. Sometimes our information is late, sometimes it's only a fraction, and it leads to bad decisions, or I'd say conflicting decisions. And it's something that actually concerns all of us, and I know it's a concern of the auditors, that the information necessary for decisions to be made, the correct decision to be made, is not necessarily flowing freely or flowing in a timely manner. and it's something that we have to address. We do have weaknesses in the reporting system, significant ones. Weaker than I'm used to, because I used to be in the private sector. We used to have better reporting systems. I know the current acting accountant general is working on resolving that. But he's constrained by resources as well. And I'm not talking just budgetary resources, that's one thing. He's constrained by the hands he has on deck and the capabilities of the people he has right now, because their skill sets might be dated in that type of technology. In that case, he has to look to outsourcing. Fortunately, when it comes to budget, one of the first areas that's cut is professional services, which is where your outsourcing is done, followed by training, which is where you build your internal capacity. So we struggle to get certain things done, which should be a normal practice in business. And then you end up with the few good people being stretched to ineffectiveness because they have so many things to do or have to participate in so many different activities that they cannot focus and effectively solve or deal with one problem. So we overuse the good resources, burn them out, and not deal with the problem from a strategic perspective. And we need to address it from a strategic perspective. And part of the difference in information between people is, and I really shouldn't say this, is that we look too short of a term in terms of where we want to go, instead of an impact, and then align everything towards that impact. It's always about, what's best for the next year, or the next 6 months, or the next 2 years. We need to look a little bit beyond that, and then let everything align along the way. When you set up a business, you don't really expect to make a whopping profit in the first 5 years, but you put everything in place that you need to have in place so that when you reach the cash cow situation, you can milk it effectively. We just never reach there. These are just my opinions.
No, absolutely. And I mean, for me, it's interesting as well to get the CFO's perspective on where they fit in this kind of equation, because again, we understand that in a perfect world we'd have more resources, we'd have all the bells and whistles, but in my opinion, so I'll give you my opinion, which everyone has one, some are more relevant than others.
Yes, sir.
But I think that going back to a centralized system and cutting off some fat, so to speak, could do well for government. I mean, but and I'm saying that in a very simplistic term. Yeah. Taking what you've said into account and the dynamics of the role and how it fits in with the overall plan of government. And this is where the question is coming from. Do you, as a CFO, know where the government is going? Has that been communicated to you? And would that help you in your strategic decisions and your roles and responsibilities?
Normally, we get the broad government or political perspective, which is fully communicated through various means, the media, at sessions that we may have, etc. But what is often missing is the link between that and the actual planning for what are you going to deliver. And you have some people who may say it's there, but is it really there when you come out and say, okay, this is it, you have 1 week now to produce an operational situation to match it? It's not feasible. It takes a little bit more time than that to plan your resources, have a strategic think, or rational look at things. Very often we get an SPNS that comes out, and usually, more recent times and others, you know about what's in the SPNS after it's actually passed. You say, okay, here's your budget, and you get one line that says you have $5 million. Not much else to it. That's not very strategic in my opinion. It needs a little bit more than that. And then now you have to operationalize that. With our strategic position too, we also very often come up with a position at, say, October, November. And then it's totally forgotten about until March, maybe end of the year. Normally, in a private sector organization, you would have a strategic position, and then you would sort of permeate that through the organization down to the lowest rung. And you would constantly beat the drum, and everyone would have, at the end of the day, everyone would come out singing the same song continuously. It's like when you're doing arithmetic in school back in the day, where you do your timetables every morning, you will come out, and at some point in time, it's the only thing you know that's where we're all going, and everybody has the same song. I think we are missing a little bit of that, and we could have more. As to centralization, you need to be careful there. I think the best approach is a hybrid, because we moved from centralization because we had certain problems. The thing is that we have had enough of an accounting generation now that people have forgotten what those problems were. They will come back to haunt you when you go back. It's like a pendulum. The first swing, you go the highest, right? And then you swing back, and then you keep swinging back and forth until you come to resonance. We need to watch the swing and be careful, because you also introduce, we already complained about bureaucracy. Check a centralized environment. That is bureaucracy ultimate. And if you think you have kings and queens now, when you have that scenario, you develop quite a few emperors. So it should be tempered in the way you do it. And I don't think the auditors are suggesting that we go to a purist centralized environment. But there are some services that actually can benefit from centralization. I'll give you an instance. In our ministry, we have centralized certain types of procurement to distinct advantage. It doesn't mean that the departments that are actually benefiting us are not involved. They are fully involved. They're the ones who determine the needs. It's just that we consolidate and make a leverage position when we procure. And we have a full procurement policy, which we actually publish to all departments and even put on our website as to, this is the procurement policy of the ministry. This is what you should follow. And we train people on it. We have been able to cut significant costs by doing that. But does that mean that we're going to centralize the procurement of pencils? The benefit you will get, the cost of administration will vastly outpace that benefit. So it's a hybrid situation. You have to have your limits. There are certain things that are more critical or that you can yield benefit from. There are some things that centralizing will not yield you the benefit you think. Actually, it might add costs. Well, I didn't want to allude to interagency, but that was a classic example. Strip it out, and what happens? The cost of those services rise.
Mr. Chinsey, in little over a year that I have been here in the Legislative Assembly, we've seen a number of audited financial statements tabled. One thing I have yet to ever see from a core government entity is an annual report that's required by PMFL.
Agreed.
Why is that? What precludes core government entities that are reporting into the LA from including an annual report?
Sir, an annual report is what should be done. And to be honest, nobody really cares about what your balance sheet says or your P&L says as much as that is a detail, rather than what the management says is supposed to be our core value, where we're going, what we're trying to achieve, what we have actually accomplished. And these are the things that go into the section of annual report. When you get an annual report for Microsoft, you're more interested in the new products that they're coming with and how they're going to go with their marketing, how they're going to grow the organization, as opposed to You want to know, yes, the bottom line, profit and loss, that you're making a profit. But as to the structure of their balance sheet, a little bit on the leverage, etc. But the fine details is less important than where they're going with their products. In government, we have a history of just putting out financial statements, which I think personally is a weakness. You lose an opportunity to market and get people on the same, or even to spark the discussion. One of the reasons I think we have not been doing it is because management, and I'm not talking the accountants here, because that section is actually never really done by accountants. They just compile it in the report. The management doesn't have the culture of actually doing that. And some may not be aware that it's something that we should do and that it's useful. I don't know, but I've not seen it as a routine thing in the Cayman Islands. When I was in the private sector, when we produced those board reports, that section better be there. If that section is not there, you're going home the third week of the month, because you had to have them to the board members by the second week of the following month, and you needed that section in the reports.
Just to follow through with that a little bit more, do you know whether the timely production of these reports, such as an annual report, is a part of your performance agreements with the Deputy Governor? I'm not sure at this point. I'd have to go back and look where the responsibility ultimately lies, whether it's the Chief Officer or the CFO that would prepare the report.
That would have to be the Chief Officer.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure if it's in their performance agreements now. Maybe Mr. Goff could probably you have to check, but yeah.
Okay.
Just from our perspective, the Chief Officer is responsible for the production of the annual report and ultimately the accounts as well, actually.
Ultimately, but yeah, the buck stops there. If your CFO is not, this is where I talk about when I talk about making somebody accountable. If your CFO is not performing, you should actually have the authority to get a CFO who is performing. Or else, how can you make them accountable if they don't have control over the resources?
In terms of how we manage the systems in government, when we look at the legislative framework, it sets out a roadmap that talks about the management of outcomes and results. Yet when we look at what happens in practice, it's you're focusing on managing activities and outputs.
Yes.
Right? Why hasn't that framework been developed to that is required by the legislation to put those things in place?
You can't manage by legislation. You can set up a framework and the policy, etc. A critical thing that is missing, as I mentioned before, is that link between what is the strategic and the operational, where the activity is driven. So yes, we do a lot of activities, but to what results? And those results must match into a strategic framework as to where we're going. You don't need to change the PMFL to do something. There's a misconception that if it's not in the law, you can't do it. That's not true. If it's a good thing to do and it's good governance, you should do it. We don't effectively manage what should be delivered, and that links to the strategic outcomes that we are trying to achieve. And I think that's a weakness in strategic planning and operationalizing the strategic performance. That must be tied through to some performance mechanism in government. We don't really have an effective one except the pat on the back. In my experience, the pat on the back works, but it works in the short term. I know that I don't know what can be done at this stage. I don't have a solution for that problem, but we need to look beyond the activity, because we spend a lot of money doing things that really doesn't generate any meaningful outcome to the people of the Cayman Islands, and we need to stop doing that. We do things just because, oh, we have always done it this way, but is it relevant now? The most common answer I get to why are we doing this? We have always done it, and that's not a good reason to continue to do something. Change management is an issue. There are just some people who don't like change, but in this type of world, government is not immune. It's now a more global place. Whether or not we want to believe that government is a monopoly, it's only a monopoly in Cayman Islands. It's not a monopoly worldwide. And as we have seen, especially with services, which we are predominantly in, people can switch location anywhere in the world as simple as changing an IP address from your web server. You don't need to be physically domiciled here to perform financial services here, or things like that. And very often we forget that this small space, we need to be a more customer focused and things like that. And I think that's one of the big things that's missing too. We don't deal with customers of the government as customers. We deal with them very often as people who have no choice but to deal with us. And it does hurt in the long run. It at least gets people in the frame like that. Listen, I don't want to deal with government. They're all problem people, and they should all go away. We need to change some of the culture where that is concerned.
Amen. Sorry. Did I say that loud? In terms of the financial statements and the Ipsos compliance to us, what do you believe that each ministry should be doing to prepare them to the standards set out by international public service, I guess, criteria? Because if you listen to the Auditor General before, we're getting there, we're moving there, but there's still improvement. Like, what can the system do to get better quicker and to get up to scratch quicker?
It's about capacity, sir. And I don't necessarily mean more people. I am not actually suggesting more people. It's actually, you have to mentor, coach, and build the people you have. Put in mechanisms for them to actually understand what is required. I don't think most people really understand what is required of the standards. And it's pretty principle-based. You don't have to know these standards verbatim. You just have to understand a few basic principles and be able to research them. But that means that somebody has to make a decision and somebody has to analyze. And you can actually, what we did in the Ministry of Home Affairs is that we put a lot of emphasis on training, building capacity with the staff. And that's not sending them off to an accounting course or something like that. You also need a mentor to coach them and guide them, and whenever they have an issue that they need to deal with, you can actually answer it. But I don't think we put enough emphasis on developing our own local resources to understand the standards and do them. The PD week once a year is a great thing, but it doesn't, whereas it does, it sort of updates you as to what is coming and what some of the issues that you have to deal with. It doesn't let's say, coach it in the environment. This is an ongoing thing, and it's not something that can happen overnight. You have to gradually build the capacity to do this. We have come a long way. I mean, when I came here 6 years ago, it was really, as far as I was concerned, an absolute disaster. And to be honest, They didn't tell me that was how it was before I came. I was sort of ambushed. And when I saw it, I was actually shocked. And the first thing I did, I said, listen, Mr. Banks, who was the chief officer at the time, effectively deputy assistant, deputy chief secretary, is that we have to plan our way out of this. How are we going to tackle this problem? And it's not a problem that you can solve overnight. But we have come far enough to be able to do that. And there is no reason why we can't meet the standards in the medium term. I mean, the standards are the standards. We need some standards so that we can compare and everybody on the same foot, and that we don't have people window dressing to their own specific needs, etc. And this is why there are general accounting standards throughout the world, and, as you know, and organization. And whether it's IPSAS, IFRS, UK GAAP, they all have the same fundamental reporting principles, which makes it comparable. And if you really want to get to the details, you know where the differences are. And they are few, really. Few and some of them not even material. But we need to build capacity, sir.
Would it help for accountability purposes if each ministry had to prepare and table their own financial statements in the house? I mean, or before the well, I guess in the house, meaning ultimate accountability, right? If you know that on X date you have to prepare and table your reports, and it counted towards your performance management,
Yes, sir.
and your accountability to the system, and that this was the date that you had. Do you think that would cure some of these late reports or the different things there? I mean,
It
what's your
would
view?
by reprioritizing certain things. Remember, chief officers and senior managers prioritize based on to use an analogy, the loudest screaming child. And if the loudest screaming child at this point is to get a budget out, that falls by the way. I do notice that there is a correlation between a statutory deadline that affects your performance and actually delivering something. It will help, but it will have to be reasonable, or else it will fall away as a nuisance objective. Everybody gets the same mark, so it doesn't matter. We're all bundled together. Right now, there is no reason why it's not tabled. Actually, I think the law requires that we table it by a certain time and actually table it in the House. So it is there. But just because it's not tied to their performance, it might be the issue. So it's all about accountability and a performance-based requirement.
Then why have we come from a system where they were repeatedly late and no one got slapped on the
Performance.
the knuckle?
It's not tied into performance agreement. It is now, yeah. Okay. So it is now. And actually, in our ministry, we have also started to tie some of those financial performance objectives into the performance agreements of the senior managers, because one of the difficulties I can appreciate the Ministry of Finance has, as well as we have been having, is when you're trying to produce your accounts by statutory deadline at the end of the year, and you say to a department manager, well, I need these fixed assets counted by this time. It will not be the priority if there is something else that they deem to have a higher priority, especially if it's not in their performance agreements. So we have included some of those to make sure that they recognize the importance of it.
Thank you, Mr. Jensi. In terms of your role as CFO, do you think that you're given appropriate guidance in terms of what you're accountable for, what you have to deliver, how you have to deliver these programs with regard for value of for money and achieving good outcomes? Or do you think that you, because of your experience, because of your skill set, that you sort of
Assume it.
assume it and play it as it goes along? Because this goes back to the legislation aspect of it, and said we don't really need to legislate for certain good governance practices. But if, and I'm just going to use you here because you're in the room, if you're a good CFO, somebody else isn't as good or as competent, and somebody else is even less competent, how do we get the value for money? How do we get the CFOs at least doing the minimum required for that job, not the added value, not everything else, by just leaving them up to their own devices based on their own strengths and weaknesses and their own vision? And I guess I'm asking a very broad-based question, as I normally do, but I'm concerned in terms of, public money being spent and getting the most bang for the buck and ensuring that we get the most bang for the buck. So in my mind, that would be, here's your role, here's your responsibilities, and here's the added value that we expect from you just because you're a CFO. Here's what we want delivered. Here's the time frame we want it delivered in. And at the end of the day, when you do this job and hopefully do it well, here are the rewards, etc. Is that complete package being communicated to you, being expected of you, and then having you being held accountable to the people of the Cayman Islands through those various deputy governor, etc., stops and checks? And when I say you, I mean
I know.
CFOs.
Technically, the CFO role is actually defined. First thing when a CFO is employed is that there is a job description. There is what is required. Some things are seated in the PMFL. First thing I was given to read when I joined was a copy of the PMFL, and I had to read it cover to cover to understand how things worked. But any manager or any employee, you have to assume certain responsibilities of the role. And there are very often, more often than not, times when you assume the duties from a principle base that, listen, okay, we have weaknesses. It's my duty to manage that process or to assume that role. You may take on additional stuff. I would argue that for most CFOs, only about 30% of your actual role is really accounting. Most of the other stuff is management and dealing with staff, etc. It helps, it always helps if roles are more clearly defined and people have a broad understanding. I'm not sure for that all CFOs are fully conversant with their role. I don't know. I'm not in their shoe to tell, right? I do know, I understand what my role is within my ministry because we have a very tight-knit team and we understand each other's role. I can't speak to the other ministries or organizations from that perspective, but it's not difficult in my mind to tell what my role is or to assume what my role is. And sometimes there are things that straddle many roles. Any of the five managers that we have can do them. But then you may say, okay, I might have a little slack next week. I'll take that task on. And we do have regular management meetings where we actually share up what is more, you probably call communal work. But in terms of pigeonholing a role, some people take that the wrong way and say, okay, if it's not on this list, I'm not supposed to do it. That's the bad approach. Unfortunately, you do get some people who actually do that. It's not on the list, so it's not my job. I don't look at it that way, and most people I work with in my organization don't look at it that way, but I can see where some people do that. I've seen it happen.
Can you describe your role vis-a-vis this SAGCs? How's your, as a CFO, what's your kind of interaction in the Ministry of Home Affairs with SAGCs and the like?
In terms of the SAGCs from Home Affairs, most of them are suppliers to us, right? But we do have an SAGC, and as Internal and External Affairs, we also had an SAGC. Most of your role comes with interacting with them from budget one, reporting another, and sometimes policy. Sometimes there are directives that affect all of government. You will communicate to them, have interaction with them, and how are we going to do this together. It depends on how coupled that SAGC is with your organization. I would assume that, example, in tourism, the airport and Cayman Airways would be more closely knitted with the Ministry of Tourism. However, we have, like the National Drug Council, we work very closely with them to achieve the rehabilitation component of our targets, etc. But in our ministry, we don't have very many SAGCs. We only have one, and they are very efficient at doing what they are doing. So we require them to report to us on a quarterly basis what they have actually done, what they have accomplished, and what they spend before we actually pay them for anything. So in respect of SAGCs, just like how we have to report to get funding, they have to report to get funding, and they have to perform based on what we require. Not all SAGCs get direct funding from government. Those are a little bit more difficult to control. And I'm just fortunate that we don't have any of those.
My only other question, if no one else has, is in terms of the Public Accounts Committee and our recommendations, and I guess that would be in addition to the recommendations by the Auditor General in these reports. You know, what could we do as a committee to help you address any of the significant shortcomings identified in his report? Again, vis-a-vis the things accepted by the civil service as things to take forward. I mean, we touched on resources before. I mean, that's almost an obvious answer. But other things in terms of recommendations by this committee that I mean, you might not have any, but I just thought I'd throw it out there just to see how can we help with the process.
The Public Accounts Committee, being members of the Legislative Assembly, has a closer tie with Cabinet and the Legislative Assembly as a whole. The best benefit is the influence there in terms of what needs to be done in terms of, like, example, we talk about strategic guidelines. The Public Accounts Committee, the members themselves actually has the capability to influence their peers. And I think that's the best way that I can think of right now off the bat that it can help. As well as follow-ups on some of the things, recommendations that are made throughout these reports and from the PAC itself. It's communication mostly.
Any other questions for this witness? Mr. Jinsey, all it remains for me to do is just to thank you for your testimony here this morning. I truly appreciate the candid way in which you have answered the questions, and want to thank you once again for appearing. You're excused. Thank you, sir. Committee would like now to call the final witnesses to appear before us this morning. They would be Ms. Lizette Yearwood, who is the CEO of the Health Services Authority, and she is accompanied by Mr. Jonathan Tibbetts, who is chairman of the HSA, and Ms. Heather Booth, the CFO. Sit at the front row here. Sit down at the front, right here, it'd be fine. You can ignore the papers that are there, the folders there from yesterday's meeting of members. Thank you all for attending this Public Accounts Committee meeting this morning. For the record, would you each of you please speak into the microphone and state your name and your position?
Mr. Chairman, Lizette Yearwood, Chief Executive Officer of the Health Services Authority.
Mr. Chairman, Jonathan Tibbetts, Chairman, HSA.
Heather Booth, Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you all for attending this morning. Members of the committee, will open this up for you to question these witnesses. Just like to mention, though, that Captain Eugene has asked that he needed to leave by midday. That means we will no longer be quorate, and so we would want to try and wrap up this testimony as quick, certainly by 12 o'clock. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess this is for Ms. Yearwood. In the Auditor General's report, the survey of statutory authority and government company governance, you responded to that survey. There was a response to the survey, and we talked about good governance and talked about specific actions that needed to be taken after that. How has that affected the HSC, and what's been taken on board after that that report and the response to that report specifically by the HSC?
Mr. Chairman, following that questionnaire, we had basically a new board, and there have been other members that have been changed over from that time. So from the very inception of the board, we ensure that the board understands the health services law and they're properly oriented to the organization. So from that aspect, the board members all disclose any personal interests, and they understand what their role and remit is within the organization. the board chairman also assigns various members with specific skill sets to a subcommittee. And each one of the subcommittees have a specific terms of reference so they understand what the remit of that subcommittee is and how that subcommittee reports into the board. And then the board will then give me, as the CEO, various directives to carry out. So in essence, to kind of summarize what has come out of that is to ensure that there's clear lines of accountability from the board to the management. One of the other things that we do on an annual basis as well is to sit down with the board and management and other stakeholders to look at our strategic plan. So we look at the strategic plan and we determine what revisions need to be made for the upcoming year in preparation for the budget process. So that process then is carried out, and the board then gives specific directives as to what they want from a policy directive, and then the senior managers with the other stakeholders will sit down and put together action plans. Those action plans with those specific objectives are then cascaded down throughout the organization. So each one of those action steps is assignable to a senior manager, and then that senior manager obviously has staff under them that will help them carry out the action steps that are assigned for that year. Then there's an implementation plan, and that implementation plan then is rolled up in our budget process, in the ownership agreement. So those would be specific objectives that we are tasked to achieve for that year. Now, having said that, there are things that happen during the course of the year that might change what is achieved during the year, and then those explanations are then given at the end of the year to determine whether or not we have achieved all of the objectives, and if some of those objectives have to be carried over to another year. For example, if there's no financial resources, then that would be carried over. Or maybe, something happened during the course of the year that required us to take another action item in accordance with the board. So that then is updated at the end of the year. So in essence, even though there are some changes, there are clear lines of accountability all the way from the ministry given broad strategic objectives to the board then giving those objectives to myself, and then those objectives cascading down throughout the organization.
Ms. Yearwood, one of the pieces of evidence we heard this morning, I think it was from the Deputy Governor, is that government's in the process of drafting a public authorities law. Do you support the creation of this legislation, and what would you hope to gain from it as CEO of a statutory authority?
Mr. Chairman, I welcome a public authorities law because it will assist us in ensuring there's uniformity between the statutory authorities, because there are differences in the legislation that government statutory authorities, and in so doing then there's difference in the way that the statutory authorities carry out their operations. So from a uniformity perspective, I think it would be very helpful as long as the law has taken into consideration all of the unique aspects of each one of the authorities that the law will guide.
And Mr. Tibbetts, if I could ask you, in your role as chair of the authority, what do you perceive as your role in ensuring the principles of good governance are implemented throughout the authority?
One of the key roles of the board is to make sure that the directives, our broad objectives from the ministry, gets passed on to the senior management at the HSA. One of the ways we make sure that we as a board are competent in the running of the authority is to make sure each of the members are specialized or expertise in their particular field. For example, doctors on the clinical subcommittee, auditors and accountants on the finance and audit committees, HR specialists in HR and so forth. So we make sure that each particular subcommittee that is a subset of the board is operated by our coordinated and conducted by a specialized person in their field. So in so doing, we end up with a skill set that makes sure that there's checks and balances in place, and any particular senior manager that sits on those boards can also bounce ideas or suggestions off of the chair of the subcommittee, who's specialized in that area.
Something you mentioned too just really piqued my interest. And I mean, clearly you indicated to me you have a number of subcommittees of your board to deal, like an audit committee or whatever other committees you have. Sound like there were about 3 of them that you named there. I haven't heard others SAGCs talk about that. Is that something that you develop in your role as chair, or is it a practice and procedures that you found while you went there? And
the procedure was there prior to me getting there. We've certainly tried to strengthen it and make sure that each, subcommittee chair is a professional in their field. They're, qualified duly and certainly have experience. So it is something that was there in place. It's in the, if I'm not mistaken, it's in the law for the HSA as well, or the policies for the HSA. To have the subcommittees with audit committee, finance subcommittee. We have an IT subcommittee, we have a clinical subcommittee, and HR subcommittee as well. So we try to cover, based on the board as well, the different areas.
And do these committees operate with clearly defined roles and responsibilities?
Yes.
and reporting guidelines?
They all have a term of reference and reporting sessions and so forth back to the board from each of the subcommittees. And there, one thing I'd like to point out is each subcommittee is not run by one board member. For example, there's at least 2 board members on each subcommittee. So there's continuity. There's different perspectives that can be gleaned from having other personnel or other board members on those committees. So it is a very I think fair way of operating a subcommittee, so that there's not one person dominating the entire subcommittee.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, through you to the chairman of the board, in that we've seen the Auditor General's framework for good governance and the setting out best practice. Are there any things in there you would challenge or based on the practicality of what you do and how you have to perform it? Are there any things in there that you would say, well, yes, this is here, but in practice, this is how we've dealt with it, this is how we deal with it, and we might agree to disagree on those, or are most of those things that you do now and you can improve on based on those guidelines?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I must say that overall the organization is run fairly efficiently through the guidelines that have been put in place. Not to say that we can't improve, or that there aren't areas that we look into on a regular basis. We have a strategic planning meeting coming up this weekend to look at areas where we can improve. We'd certainly be happy to report back in areas where we think the board is able to govern better. But we've also been through some training. I don't remember if the Auditor General was responsible for establishing that, or government, or who, but there was training for the boards and governance of the statutory authorities that was held back in November of 2013. So overall, I would say that we do follow the practices laid out there, and as a board, we will certainly identify if there are areas that we may need to tweak, as you suggested, to make it more efficient. Do
you have another question, Mr. Connolly? No? I just wanted to ask a favor of you, if you could, because I'm really interested in what you're telling me about your subcommittees, the way you've done it, because I think it is an example of good governance. Could I ask you if you could provide this committee with copies of the terms of reference for your subcommittees?
Certainly, we can do that, and it also lays out the makeup of the committee so that you understand why each person sits on the committee. It's not.
I think that would really be helpful.
We
for
certainly
us.
can do that for you. Sir.
I think it is a good example of best practice, I would think.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add, I think the subcommittees also ensure that the board operates in a most efficient manner possible, because you have the expertise at those subcommittee levels. So if there is a matter that is brought forward by senior management, for example, the subcommittees can really deep dive into it at that smaller level. And then if it's a recommendation that they support, then that's a recommendation that's taken then to the board for ratification, rather than the board be subjected with all of these proposals that still have to be examined on a more unique level.
Other questions for these witnesses?
Mr. Chairman, through you, we often hear a lot about SAGCs. They seem to be the theme of the month, so to speak, but that means every month in government. Is there anything you'd like to share with this committee in terms of the, I guess the things that impede you in carrying out some of the expectations, both written and otherwise, in terms of delivering on those outputs, et cetera, that you're charged with?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, funding would be one of the major issues. Another, which that's up to government to, determine, and we certainly do our best to put in place every possible outcome and have everything as requested as best as possible, stretching money as far as it can go, and being accountable for every penny is key. But funding, of course, does impede slightly. One of the other areas that I think impedes perhaps is actually the expectation of the role of the board. A lot of times people think a board is an operational board, and we are not in any way, shape, or form operational. We do not get involved with the operations of the organization. We are strictly there for policy and procedure, strategic planning, and so forth with the senior management. So once we understand our role as a board, I think we can be more successful in the operations because the senior management is clear on their delivery of action plans and items for us to review and improve on and so forth. So, the actual expectations of the board, I think, has been an issue that impedes us because we're constantly bombarded with, you need to get this done, you need to get that done. There are policies and procedures in place for us to make sure the outcomes are all delivered. But it's not the board's responsibility to be an operational board or an operations board, where we actually get involved with the day-to-day running of the organization. So, the funding is the most critical by far. But then, of course, the expectations of the board to be operational, which is not the directive for the board, or is not the responsibility of the board to be in that position.
I'd just like to add, Mr. Chairman, through you, a little bit more in regards to the funding and the process of funding, the budget process, because as the chairman said, there are expectations for us as a public hospital to deliver a certain level of service, but without the appropriate funding, then it's very difficult to do so. And whereas perhaps there's a different level of understanding for maybe non-emergency operations, but when it comes to an emergency operation, then the expectations are held, and we're not really forgiven very easily in regards to that. Something I'd like to just touch upon, because this is something that we seem to be out of sync with almost every year. we try very early on to have our strategic review retreat, September, latest October, to be able to put in place what we think should be the strategic directives for the coming year. But we seem to get out of sync from the SPS retreat. For some reason, I may be wrong in regards to this, but there doesn't seem to be as much communication, two-way communication in that regard, because a lot of initiatives based on the review of data and feedback from managers come up at that strategic planning session that should really be incorporated into the output allocation for the coming year. But it seems that, I guess because of lack of resources, we never do get that piece right. For example, you know, for the last few years, we've been requesting to have another EMS operations site because the district of Bodden Town is growing, Savannah is growing, so we feel that, you know, in reviewing our data, we need to have another location designated to have an ambulance based. And I guess because of funding, we always have to cut current outputs as well as any future outputs that we foresee the need for. So that process, I think we could improve on a little bit better. I know it's still going to be restrained by resources, but maybe the resources could be reallocated if we had a little bit more communication in a timely manner in order to be able to effect whatever the decisions are made at that SPS retreat from our perspective.
I hear you. Clearly, in your assessment, where does the breakdown occur? Why, in terms of that communication? Why isn't that taking place? Or are we simply just talking a timing issue?
To be honest, I don't know what the exact answer is. I think oftentimes it is a timing issue. And then at other times, I think it's just pure lack of resources. So even if we'd had the information that was put forward in a timely manner, those resources aren't available.
Any further questions for these witnesses? If there are no further questions, go ahead, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Ronnie Dunn, Acting Accountant General. And just to pick up on what Ms. Yearwood just said in my capacity, as well as Director of Budget and Management, that it is something that the Minister of Finance recognizes. It was discussed within our weekly management meeting last week, and it is intended that in the upcoming budget process, that key stakeholders such as health service authorities, statutory authorities, government-owned companies will be given an opportunity to be more active in the policy setting process by having the strategic objectives and goals of the organization communicated up to the Ministry of Finance and the Cabinet so that policy setting on the medium-term basis can be more informed. So we do realize that initially when the financial reform began, we did have a detailed SPS session where agencies would go up and give a presentation as to what their intents were for the next 3 years. Then it seemed like that fell by the wayside. Again, it became more of a top-down approach. But there is benefit in having that input that is recognized, and you will see that coming forward in the upcoming budget process.
Thank you very much for that input. If there are no further questions, go ahead, Mr. Conley.
Sorry, I just had one. In terms of going forward, implementing the ownership and purchase agreements that set out clear performance objectives and accountability. How, I guess, if we were to ask you back here in 6 months, a year, what would be the story? What would you tell us that you've done to get those things? The framework in place that the Auditor General has said isn't working very well. Like, what's that plan going forward?
Mr. Chairman, through you, I think one of the weaknesses that we have self-assessed and determined is really a very clear line of accountability by which we cascade those strategic objectives right through the organization. We do it clearly to the senior management, but obviously the senior management isn't going to be able to achieve everything on their own, right? So it's very important that every member of staff in the organization knows what their individual responsibility is into achieving the big strategic objective. And we have, over the years, tried to reform our performance appraisal tool to make it a little bit more user-friendly, but yet still have the information in there that makes it a meaningful and useful tool and an objective tool. Because up until now, you know, we've been talking, you know, in government in regards to incentive, bonuses, and that sort of thing. But in truth and in fact, you need to have a very objective tool in order to be able to deliver such a process. So we have, in the last probably about 4 years, we changed our tool, and it still is very onerous, very, very cumbersome. And as a result of that, we don't have 100% compliance throughout the organization. So more recently, with the current board, we've been looking at other tools, and I looked at the portfolio of civil service, and they have what I consider, relatively speaking, is quite a good tool. It's an electronic-based tool now. So we had representatives from the portfolio of civil service come and demo it to senior management, and the next step is to demo it to the HR subcommittee to see if that is something that we want to adopt, because I think that it has all of the relevant, you know, stages, subjects in it, and it is also more user-friendly than what we have now. So I think that the compliance in using it will be better. And as a result, then we can ensure that we are delivering on these objectives. You know, I think that it's important for us to be able to say that, yes, we have accomplished these things, but we need to make sure that every single member of staff understands their responsibility and take ownership, because we know, I mean, we know even with customer service that, you know, you can have the best customer service in one pocket of the organization, but unless every person feels their individual responsibility in how to deliver that, it's not going to be accomplished consistently and effectively throughout the organization. So that's one of the things that I'd like to be able to report back, you know, in a year's time, to say that we're doing better in regards to our performance appraisal process throughout the organization.
I guess I don't have any more questions for you, but just speaking to the Auditor General's team and just the relationship between you and the HSA, the board, are there any things that you have that are critical concerns, meaning that, you know, you'd like to see accomplished as well within short, medium, and long term meaning a year from now, other than what you've reported on, what you've seen started on, that, you know, you would think is a priority that needs to be addressed, and perhaps as the committee we could make any recommendations to say, well, you know, maybe the HSA, can you consider this as a priority if this isn't a priority? Just thinking about how we assist both sides in getting, you know, down the road and having some sort of agreed priorities list.
Thanks for that. I think this is it's for the HSA, but for most SAGCs, what I'd like to see in the next year is the effectiveness of the ownership agreements being put into place in terms of the clear accountability back to government for the delivery of the results, and that being effectively implemented. If that was the one thing that came out in the next year, is that we can see clearly what results are being driven through government policy and then through the strategic policy of the authorities, and the actual delivery at the other end of that year, and that's getting reported back effectively. So there's accountability for actually delivering about what has been required, or on reporting progress to achieving those objectives. That would be the one thing that I would see would be the greatest benefit from my perspective. You know, that process working effectively, because I can't comment. I can't remember what the HSA's ownership agreement looks like, but generally, as we've talked about, a lot of it's about activity rather than actually achieving results and what you're trying to achieve. So if we get that into a good position, I think that would be the most beneficial thing from my perspective.
There are no further questions for these witnesses. Then I would like to thank you all for attending this session of the Public Accounts Committee this morning. Thank you for your candidness and the way in which you have answered our questions. You've been most helpful in shedding light on this report and in terms of your work and involvement in the Health Services Authority. And again, I thank you very much. This concludes our session of the Public Accounts Committee. All members in here, you're invited to join us for lunch if you would care to do so. The smaller committee, we do have a short meeting to attend just to take care of some administrative matters. But if there aren't nothing further, then we're all excused at this time.